The snow fell like forgotten memories across the Montana wilderness, each flake carrying the weight of another day that Emmett-chan had survived alone. She pressed her face against the frosted window of her cabin, watching the white blanket grow thicker on the ground that separated her from the rest of the world. 3 years had passed since she'd spoken to another human being for more than the brief exchanges required to buy supplies in the distant town of Cedar Falls. Her breath fogged the glass as she traced patterns with her finger, the same nervous habit she developed as a child when her parents would argue late into the night. Back then, she'd draw hearts and stars on her bedroom window, making wishes that never seemed to come true. Now, at 32, she drew nothing at all, just cleared the condensation away and stared into the endless expanse of white that mirrored the emptiness she felt inside. The cabin had been her grandmother's before it became a refuge. Nestled in a valley between two mountain ridges, it sat on 40 acres of pristine wilderness that Emma had inherited along with a trust fund that allowed her to live modestly without working. Most people would have called it paradise, but Emma knew better. Paradise didn't feel like a prison, even a beautiful one. She turned away from the window and surveyed her small domain. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living area, dominated by a stone fireplace that provided both warmth and the comforting crackle of burning wood. Bookshelves lined two walls, filled with volumes she'd read multiple times. A worn leather armchair sat angled toward the fire, its arms bearing the impressions of her elbows from countless hours of reading and thinking and remembering things she'd rather forget. The isolation hadn't been intentional at first. Emma had come to the cabin 3 years ago for what was supposed to be a 2-week retreat, a chance to heal from the devastating betrayal that had shattered her carefully constructed life in Seattle. She'd been a successful marketing executive then, engaged to David Reeves, a prominent attorney who seemed to love her ambition as much as her devotion to him. They planned a Christmas wedding, complete with ice sculptures and a string quartet, 200 guests who would celebrate their perfect love story. But love stories, Emma had learned, were often just carefully crafted illusions. The discovery of David's affair with his law partner had come 3 weeks before their wedding, delivered through a private investigator's photographs that showed intimate dinners, stolen kisses, and hotel room embraces. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the realization that everyone in their social circle had known and chosen to protect David rather than tell her the truth. The humiliation had been suffocating. Canceled venues, returned gifts, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Emma had found herself unable to trust her own judgment about anything or anyone. If she could be so wrong about the man she'd planned to spend her life with, how could she trust herself about anything else? So she'd fled to the mountains, to the cabin where she'd spent childhood summers with her grandmother, a woman who'd understood the healing power of solitude. What was meant to be a temporary escape had gradually become permanent as Emma discovered that she could breathe more easily when she didn't have to navigate the complex social dynamics that had once defined her life. The routine she'd established was simple and predictable. She woke each morning as the sun crested the eastern ridge, made coffee in the same blue ceramic mug her grandmother had favored, and tended to the small garden that provided vegetables during the growing season. She'd preserve enough food to last through the winter, supplementing with monthly trips to town for supplies she couldn't grow or make herself. Books filled most of her days, along with the various maintenance tasks that mountain living required. She'd learned to split wood, fix minor plumbing issues, and maintain the solar panels and backup generator that provided power. Physical work helped quiet the voices in her head that sometimes whispered cruel reminders of her failures and shortcomings. The loneliness came in waves, usually striking without warning. Sometimes it felt like a heavy blanket that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Other times it was a sharp pain that stole her breath and left her gasping like she was drowning in the silence that surrounded her. But loneliness, she discovered, was preferable to the vulnerability that came with letting others close enough to hurt her. Her only regular companion was a red-tailed hawk she'd named Artemis, who often perched on the fence post near her kitchen window. The bird had arrived the winter after Emma's first year at the cabin, appearing each morning like a feathered sentinel watching over her small world. Emma had grown to appreciate Artemis's presence, finding comfort in the fact that another living creature chose to share space with her without demanding anything in return. This particular December morning felt different, though Emma couldn't pinpoint why. The snow was heavier than usual for early in the month, and the wind carried a sharpness that suggested a serious storm was building. She'd checked her weather radio the night before and knew a blizzard was forecast to arrive by evening, potentially dumping 2 feet of snow and bringing winds strong enough to knock out power lines. Emma had prepared as she always did, bringing extra firewood inside, checking the backup generator, and making sure she had plenty of food and water in case the storm lasted several days. Self-sufficiency had become second nature to her, born from the understanding that she truly was on her own in this remote place. As she moved through her morning routine, Emma found herself thinking about Christmas, still 2 weeks away. The holiday had lost much of its meaning for her over the past 3 years. She'd stopped putting up decorations after the first year, when the act of hanging ornaments alone had left her crying into her coffee cup. Now Christmas was simply another day to get through, marked only by the special dinner she allowed herself, and perhaps a video call with her parents in California, who still hoped she'd eventually return to what they considered normal life. Her parents meant well, but they couldn't understand her choice to remain isolated. They'd built their lives around social connections and community involvement, finding purpose in their relationships with others. Emma's father was a retired professor who volunteered at 3 different organizations, while her mother served on half a dozen charitable boards. They thrived on human interaction in ways that Emma envied but could no longer relate to. The sound of an engine broke through the morning quiet, causing Emma to freeze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. No one came to her cabin unannounced. The mail carrier left packages at the bottom of her long driveway, when necessary, and she'd made it clear to the few locals who knew of her presence that she preferred to be left alone. She moved to the window and peered out, her heart rate increasing as she spotted a dark pickup truck making its way slowly up her snow-covered driveway. The vehicle was unfamiliar, but something about the careful way it navigated the terrain suggested the driver was experienced with mountain roads and winter driving conditions. Emma watched as the truck came to a stop near her front porch, her mind racing through possibilities. Could it be someone from town with an emergency? A lost tourist who'd somehow found her remote location? The isolation that usually protected her now felt vulnerable, highlighting how truly alone she was with no neighbors close enough to hear if she called for help. The driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out into the falling snow. Even from her window, Emma could see it was a man wearing a heavy winter coat and cowboy hat, the kind of practical clothing that suggested he belonged in this harsh landscape. He moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable in his own skin, pausing to survey her cabin with what appeared to be appreciation rather than intrusion. As he approached her front door, Emma caught a better glimpse of his face. He appeared to be somewhere in his 40s, with weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors and laugh lines that suggested an easy smile. His presence didn't feel threatening, but Emma's instinct was still to retreat from human contact. The knock on her door was firm but polite, not the aggressive pounding that might suggest danger. Emma stood frozen for several seconds, debating whether to answer. She could simply wait for him to leave, pretend she wasn't home. But something about the purposeful way he'd driven up her driveway suggested he knew she was there. Taking a deep breath, Emma approached the door and called out, "What do you want?" "Ma'am, my name is Jake Sullivan. I own the ranch about 5 miles east of here. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a moment." His voice was warm and patient, carrying a slight drawl that suggested southern roots transplanted to mountain soil. Emma recognized the name Sullivan. She'd seen it on a mailbox during one of her rare trips to town, marking the entrance to what appeared to be a large cattle operation. "I prefer to be left alone," Emma replied through the door, proud that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I understand that, ma'am. I wouldn't have come if it wasn't important. I brought you something I thought you might need." Emma frowned at the unexpected statement. She hadn't ordered anything, and couldn't imagine what a rancher might think she needed. Curiosity warred with her desire to maintain her isolation, but curiosity won. She unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to see him clearly while keeping the security chain engaged. Jake Sullivan was even more imposing up close, probably 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled his winter coat. But his brown eyes held kindness, and his stance was relaxed rather than aggressive. "I don't need anything," Emma said carefully. Jake nodded toward his truck. "I noticed when I was driving past last week that you don't seem to have warm winter clothes hanging on your line. Thought you might be running low on proper gear for this kind of weather." He gestured toward the falling snow. Got a storm coming that's supposed to be pretty serious. Emma blinked in surprise. She had indeed been struggling with staying warm, relying on layering summer clothes under her grandmother's old winter coat, which was too large and not particularly effective against the harsh mountain cold. But admitting need to a stranger felt dangerous in ways that went beyond physical safety. "I'm fine," she said automatically. Jake's expression remained patient. "I'm sure you're managing. But I've got some extra winter gear that's just sitting in my closet, doing nobody any good. Figured it might be useful to someone." He paused, studying her face with eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable sharing. "The thing about mountain winters is they don't much care whether we think we're prepared. They'll teach us real quick if we're not." Despite herself, Emma felt a flutter of interest. She had been cold more often than she cared to admit, especially during the previous winter when she'd spent several miserable days huddled by the fire during a week-long cold snap. The practical part of her mind, the part that had helped her survive 3 years of self-sufficiency, recognized that proper winter clothing wasn't a luxury, but a necessity. "What kind of gear?" she heard herself ask. Jake's face brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at her question. "Good winter coat, proper boots, warm gloves, thermal underlayers. All good quality stuff that's barely been worn." He hesitated, then added, "My wife passed away 2 years ago. She was about your size, and her things have just been taking up space." The simple statement hit Emma with unexpected force. Here was someone else who understood loss, who had reason to retreat from the world but had chosen to reach out instead. The vulnerability in his admission made her own defensive walls feel suddenly heavy and unnecessary. "I appreciate the offer," Emma said slowly, "but I couldn't just take your wife's clothes." "You wouldn't be taking them," Jake replied. "You'd be using them. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Sarah always said that useful things should be used, not stored away like museum pieces. She'd have wanted her winter gear to keep someone warm rather than hang in a closet collecting dust. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Emma found herself wavering. She'd become so accustomed to refusing help, to maintaining her independence, that accepting anything from anyone felt like admitting defeat. But the logical part of her mind recognized that proper winter clothing could be the difference between discomfort and genuine danger if she faced another severe cold snap. "I don't know," she said finally. Jake nodded, as if he understood her reluctance. "Tell you what, let me bring the box to your porch. You can look through it when you're ready, keep what's useful, and I'll come back for the rest whenever you want. No pressure, no strings attached." Before Emma could respond, he was already walking back to his truck, moving with the efficient purpose of someone accustomed to making decisions and following through. She watched as he retrieved a large cardboard box from the truck bed, handling it with careful respect for its contents. He set the box on her porch and stepped back, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no intrusion. "Like I said, no pressure. But this storm that's coming is supposed to be a real test, and I'd sleep better knowing you had what you needed to stay safe and warm." Emma stared at the box, torn between gratitude and suspicion. Acts of kindness had become so foreign to her experience that she almost didn't know how to receive one. In her previous life, every gesture had carried hidden expectations or ulterior motives. But something about Jake Sullivan's straightforward manner suggested this was exactly what it appeared to be. One neighbor helping another prepare for harsh weather. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why do you care whether I stay warm?" Jake considered the question seriously rather than dismissing it. "Because that's what people do in places like this," he said finally. "We look out for each other. The mountains don't much care about our personal business or why we choose to live the way we do. But they'll kill us all the same if we're not prepared." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that somehow managed to be both old-fashioned and completely natural. "You take care, ma'am. Hope the storm passes easy for you." Emma watched him walk back to his truck, noting the slight limp that suggested an old injury and the way he paused to study the sky with the automatic assessment of someone who made his living outdoors. As the truck disappeared down her driveway, she found herself still standing in her doorway, staring at the box he'd left behind. The practical voice in her head urged her to examine its contents immediately. Winter gear was expensive, and if the items were truly suitable, they could make a significant difference in her comfort and safety. But another part of her resisted, recognizing that accepting help might be the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. As the snow began to fall more heavily, Emma made her decision. She carried the box inside and set it on her kitchen table, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she returned to her window to watch the storm's approach, thinking about a rancher who'd taken time from his own preparations to worry about a stranger's well-being. For the first time in 3 years, the approaching blizzard didn't feel quite so threatening. And for the first time since David's betrayal, Emma wondered if she'd been wrong about something fundamental, whether kindness without ulterior motives might actually exist in the world after all. The storm arrived with the fury that only mountain blizzards could muster. Emma had opened Jake's box just as the first serious winds began rattling her windows, and what she found inside had left her speechless. The winter coat was a deep forest green, clearly expensive, and barely worn, with the kind of technical features that serious outdoor enthusiasts relied on. The boots were sturdy leather with thick treads, sized perfectly for her feet. Thermal underwear still bore tags, and the gloves were lined with fleece that felt cloud-soft against her skin. But it was the note tucked between the layers of clothing that had stopped her breath entirely. Written in careful handwriting on cream-colored paper, it read, "These clothes kept me warm through 15 Montana winters. I hope they do the same for you. The mountains can be harsh, but they're also beautiful. Don't let the cold keep you from seeing the beauty. Sarah Sullivan." Emma had stared at the note for a long time, realizing that Jake hadn't just brought her his late wife's winter clothes. He brought her something much more personal. This wasn't charity or pity. It was one woman's legacy of mountain survival being passed to another, with the kind of practical wisdom that could only come from years of experience. Now, 3 days into the blizzard, Emma was grateful beyond words for Sarah Sullivan's foresight. The storm had indeed been a test, dumping nearly 3 feet of snow and bringing winds that howled like banshees around her cabin. The power had gone out on the second day, leaving her dependent on the wood stove for heat and candles for light after dark. But wrapped in Sarah's coat during her necessary trips outside to check the generator and bring in firewood, Emma had stayed warm and dry. The isolation of the storm was different from her usual solitude. Weather-imposed isolation felt natural, even cozy, rather than the self-imposed exile she'd grown accustomed to. There was something oddly comforting about being snowed in, about having the choice to be alone, temporarily removed by forces beyond anyone's control. As she sat by the fire on the third evening, Emma found herself thinking about Jake Sullivan and wondering how he was managing the storm on his ranch. Cattle needed care regardless of weather, and she imagined him trudging through drifts to check on his animals, maybe breaking ice on water tanks, and hauling hay to hungry livestock. The mental image of his steady competence in the face of the storm's challenges felt reassuring somehow. She'd been reading the same page of her book for 20 minutes, her mind wandering in directions that felt unfamiliar after so many months of carefully controlled thoughts. The note from Sarah Sullivan lay on the table beside her, and Emma picked it up again, tracing the careful cursive with her finger. What kind of woman wrote notes to strangers? What kind of life had Sarah lived that made her think about the comfort of future mountain dwellers? The wind finally began to ease around midnight, and Emma fell asleep in her chair by the fire, wrapped in one of her grandmother's quilts and wearing Sarah's thermal underwear beneath her pajamas. She woke to sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't seen clear skies in 3 days, and the profound silence that always followed major storms. Her first task was to dig out the generator shed and get power restored. The snow was deeper than any she'd experienced since arriving at the cabin, reaching nearly to her waist in places where the wind had created drifts. But Sarah's boots gripped the packed snow securely, and the coat's hood protected her face from the bitter wind that still gusted occasionally. As she worked to clear a path to the generator, Emma became aware of a distant sound that didn't belong to the post-storm quiet. It took several minutes for her to identify it as the rumble of heavy equipment, and when she climbed onto a stump to get a better view, she could see a large tractor with a snow blade working its way up the main road that passed her property. The sight filled her with mixed emotions. Part of her was relieved to know that the outside world was returning to normal, that emergency services would be available if needed. But another part mourned the loss of the storm's enforced isolation, which had felt like a legitimate reason to be cut off from everything. The tractor reached her driveway entrance and paused. Emma watched as the driver maneuvered the blade to clear not just the main road, but the first 100 yards of her private drive as well. It was an unexpected kindness that would save her hours of difficult shoveling and she wondered if Jake Sullivan had somehow arranged for the consideration. Her generator started on the third pull, filling the air with its familiar puttering sound. Electric lights seemed almost harsh after 3 days of firelight, but the refrigerator's humming return to life was reassuring. Emma made coffee and stood at her kitchen window, surveying a landscape transformed by the storm. Everything was blindingly white and impossibly clean, as if the world had been reset to its original state. The familiar landmarks were disguised by snow that had sculpted new shapes and shadows. Even her garden fence was buried except for the tops of a few posts, and the path to her woodpile had completely disappeared. Movement caught her eye, and Emma spotted Artemis perched on her usual fence post, somehow managing to look dignified despite the fact that snow nearly reached the hawk's talons. The bird's presence felt like proof that life persisted regardless of nature's challenges, and Emma found herself smiling for the first time in days. The sound of another engine broke the morning quiet, and Emma's stomach tightened as she recognized the dark pickup truck making its careful way up her newly plowed driveway. Jake Sullivan had returned, and this time Emma wasn't sure she could maintain her usual distance. Sarah's clothes had already created a connection she wasn't prepared to handle. Jake parked in the same spot as before and stepped out carrying what appeared to be a thermos and a paper bag. He moved carefully on the packed snow, testing each step before committing his full weight. When he reached her porch, he set down the bag and knocked with the same patient politeness he'd shown before. Emma opened the door without the security chain this time, noting how natural the gesture felt despite her usual caution. "Mr. Sullivan." "Jake," he corrected gently. "Just want to check that you made it through the storm okay." His eyes took in Sarah's coat, which Emma was still wearing, and his expression softened with what might have been gratitude. "I see you found some use for those winter clothes." They were... Emma paused, searching for words adequate to express what the clothes had meant during the long, cold nights. "They were exactly what I needed. Please tell me how much I owe you." Jake shook his head firmly. "You don't owe me anything, but I brought you something else." He picked up the thermos and bag he'd set down. "Fresh coffee and some of my neighbor's cinnamon rolls. Figured you might be getting tired of whatever provisions you had stored up." The offer of food felt more intimate than the clothes somehow, crossing a line from practical assistance to genuine care. "Mind if I ask if you've got enough firewood to get through the rest of the winter? Storm like this can burn through a wood supply pretty quick." Emma mentally calculated her remaining firewood and realized with a sinking feeling that Jake was right. She'd used more than usual during the 3 days without power, and what had seemed like an adequate supply now looked insufficient for the months ahead. "I'll manage," she said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't really an answer. Jake nodded slowly. "I've got plenty of seasoned wood at the ranch. More than I can use, actually. Could bring you a load if you'd like." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Emma wasn't sure she was ready to accept. Firewood was a necessity, not a luxury, but accepting it would create a debt she didn't know how to repay. More than that, it would represent another crack in the wall she'd built around herself. "Why do you keep helping me?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying years of suspicion and hurt. Jake was quiet for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air as he considered his response. "You really want to know?" Emma nodded, bracing herself for disappointment. "Because isolation's a choice until it becomes a trap," he said simply. "I've seen what happens to people who get so used to being alone that they forget how to accept help when they need it. Sarah used to worry about the folks who lived up in these mountains by themselves, especially the ones who seemed to be hiding from something rather than just preferring solitude." His words hit closer to home than Emma was comfortable with, but she couldn't deny their accuracy. What had started as a temporary retreat had indeed become something that felt increasingly difficult to escape. "I'm not hiding," she said, though the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But you're not living either. There's a difference between choosing to be alone and being afraid to be anything else." The observation stung because it was true. Emma had become comfortable with her isolation, not because she preferred it, but because it felt safer than risking further disappointment or betrayal. But safety, she was beginning to realize, came at a cost she hadn't fully calculated. "I should let you get on with your day," Emma said, stepping back from the conversation that was moving into territory she wasn't ready to explore. Jake didn't push, but he also didn't leave immediately. Instead, he set the thermos and bag on the porch railing. "Coffee's still hot," and the rolls are from Anna Martinez down the valley. She's got hands like magic when it comes to baking. He paused, then added, if you change your mind about the firewood, just let me know. Or, if you need anything else. Winter's got a long way to go yet. Emma watched him walk back to his truck, noting again the slight limp and the way he automatically scanned the sky for weather signs. As he drove away, she stood on her porch holding the thermos and bag, breathing in the aroma of cinnamon and coffee that spoke of kitchens filled with warmth and the kind of casual generosity she'd almost forgotten existed. The coffee was indeed still hot, rich, and strong in a way that spoke of careful brewing. The cinnamon roll was a revelation, light, sweet, and clearly made by someone who understood that good food was an expression of care. As Emma ate, she found herself wondering about Anna Martinez and the community of people who looked out for each other in this remote valley. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised herself. She walked to the end of her driveway, where her mailbox stood barely visible above the snow, and for the first time in 3 years, she cleared the snow away from it completely. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a signal that she was still here, still part of the world, even if she chose to live at its edges. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Emma found herself thinking about Sarah Sullivan's note. Don't let the cold keep you from seeing the beauty. The advice felt like more than practical wisdom about mountain living. It felt like an invitation to stop hiding from life itself. That night, Emma set the note on her kitchen table where she could see it while she cooked dinner. For the first time since the storm began, she ate by electric lights instead of candlelight, and the difference felt like stepping back into the world of the living. Small steps, she told herself, but steps nonetheless. Outside, the wind had finally died completely, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to ring in her ears. She pulled on Sarah's coat and boots and walked outside, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Jake looked up from the truck bed, where he was arranging split logs, and smiled. The first time she'd seen him actually smile rather than just look pleasant. Morning, he said. Hope you don't mind me taking you up on letting me bring this wood. Had to come this direction anyway, and my truck was getting pretty loaded down. Emma could see that the truck bed was packed with more firewood than she could use in 2 winters, all of it neatly split and clearly seasoned to perfect dryness. The gesture was generous to the point of embarrassment, and she felt compelled to protest. That's far too much wood for what I can possibly use. Well, I figure we might as well get you set for the rest of this winter, and next year too, Jake replied, beginning to unload logs with the same steady rhythm she'd observed before. Better to have too much than too little when you're living this far from town. Emma stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure how to respond to such casual generosity. In her former life, gifts had always come with strings attached, expectations that needed to be managed. But Jake simply continued working, apparently expecting nothing from her except perhaps a place to stack the wood. Let me help, she said finally, moving toward the truck. Appreciate the offer, but I've got a system worked out, Jake replied without pausing in his rhythm. Besides, those are good gloves Sarah picked out, but they're not really meant for handling rough wood. Get yourself some splinters, and you'll be cursing us both. The casual mention of his wife's name struck Emma as she watched him work. There was no pain in his voice when he spoke of Sarah, just a quiet fondness that suggested grief processed rather than avoided. Emma wondered what that looked like, love that continued beyond loss without becoming a burden. How long were you married? The question escaped before Emma could stop herself, and she immediately regretted the intrusion into his privacy. Jake paused in his work, a log balanced in each hand, and considered the question as seriously as he seemed to consider everything else. 22 years, he said finally. Met her at a rodeo in Billings when I was still young enough to think I could ride bulls professionally. His mouth curved slightly at the memory. She was there with friends, and I spent the whole evening trying to impress her with stories about my future in professional rodeo. Did it work? Not even a little bit. Jake laughed, the sound warm and genuine. But she was polite about it, and when I got thrown and broke 3 ribs, she was the one who drove me to the hospital. Figured if she was willing to spend her Saturday night in an emergency room with a fool who got himself hurt showing off, she might be worth getting to know better. Emma found herself smiling at the image of a young Jake Sullivan trying to impress a woman with rodeo stories and ending up in the hospital instead. What changed your mind about professional rodeo? Sarah did. Jake replied simply. Made me realize I wanted to build something that would last longer than 8 seconds on the back of an angry bull. So I used what little money I'd saved to put a down payment on some land, and we started the ranch from scratch. He continued stacking wood as he talked, the physical rhythm seeming to make conversation easier. Emma found herself relaxing into the cadence of his voice and the steady sound of logs settling into place. Was it difficult? Starting a ranch from nothing. Everything worthwhile is difficult, Jake said. But we had each other, and that made the hard times bearable and the good times worth celebrating. He glanced at Emma with an expression that was kind but penetrating. Sarah used to say that the people who made it out here long-term were the ones who understood that independence didn't mean isolation. That there's a difference between being self-reliant and being too stubborn to accept help when you need it. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, recognizing the gentle criticism embedded in his words. I suppose you think I'm too stubborn. I think you're scared, Jake said without judgment, which is understandable. Whatever brought you up here to begin with, it was probably something that made trusting people feel dangerous. The accuracy of his assessment was unsettling. Emma had become so accustomed to thinking of her isolation as a choice that she'd almost forgotten the fear that had driven her to make that choice in the first place. I trusted the wrong person, she said finally, the admission feeling dangerous even as she spoke it. Jake nodded as if he'd expected something like that. Sarah always said that the people who end up living alone in the mountains usually got hurt by someone who was supposed to love them. Said it was like getting poisoned by food. Afterward, you're afraid to eat anything, even when you're starving. The metaphor was so apt that Emma felt tears threaten for the first time in months. She turned away, pretending to study the growing pile of firewood, and tried to regain her composure. The thing about poison, Jake continued conversationally, is that the antidote isn't to stop eating forever. It's to learn to recognize good food when you see it. Emma remained silent, not trusting her voice. Jake seemed to understand her struggle and worked quietly for several minutes, giving her time to process what he'd said. You know, he said eventually, Christmas is coming up next week. Anna Martinez is putting together a community dinner at the church in Cedar Falls. Nothing fancy, just neighbors sharing a meal and some conversation. You'd be welcome if you wanted to come. The invitation hit Emma like a physical blow. A community dinner meant people, lots of them, all expecting conversation and social interaction she'd forgotten how to navigate. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers trying to make small talk and pretending to be normal felt overwhelming. I don't think that a good idea, she said quickly. Fair enough, Jake replied without pressure. But if you change your mind, it starts at 5 o'clock on Christmas Day. The church is the white building right in the center of town. Hard to miss. He finished stacking the last of the wood and stepped back to survey his work. The pile was impressive, representing warmth and security for many months to come. Emma felt the weight of obligation settling on her shoulders. How much do I owe you for all this? Jake waved the question away. Already told you. I had more than I could use. Besides, Sarah always insisted that neighbors helping neighbors wasn't about keeping score. Said the mountains would humble all of us enough times that we'd be grateful for whatever kindness we could find. He walked back to his truck and pulled something from behind the driver's seat, a small wrap package that he handed to Emma before she could protest. What's this? Early Christmas present, Jake said, suddenly, looking slightly embarrassed. Nothing fancy, just something Sarah would have wanted you to have. Emma held the package carefully, feeling the weight of expectation and kindness that it carried. I don't have anything for you. Wasn't looking for anything, Jake replied. Sometimes giving a gift is its own reward. He climbed into his truck and rolled down the window. Emma, he said, using her name for the first time since they'd met. I know it's none of my business, but isolation stops being protection when it starts being punishment. Just something to think about. Emma stood holding the package and watching his truck disappear down her driveway, his words echoing in her mind. When had her protective isolation become self-imposed punishment? When had safety become just another word for prison? That evening, she sat by her fire and carefully unwrapped Jake's gift. Inside was a small photo album with a note attached. Pictures of the valley through the seasons. Sarah took these over the years. She always said that beauty shared was beauty doubled. Maybe it's time to start seeing this place as home instead of hiding place. Emma opened the album to find photographs that captured the mountain valley in every season and mood. Spring wildflowers carpeting meadows she'd never explored. Summer sunsets painting the peaks in impossible colors. Fall aspen groves creating tunnels of gold. Winter scenes that transformed familiar landscapes into magical kingdoms. But it was the final photograph that stopped her breath. It showed a woman who could only be Sarah Sullivan standing in the very meadow Emma could see from her kitchen window. Sarah was laughing at something off camera, her face bright with joy and her arms spread wide as if to embrace the entire valley. She looked like someone who had found her place in the world and was completely at peace with it. Emma studied the photograph for a long time, trying to understand what she saw in Sarah's face that felt so foreign to her own experience. It took several minutes to identify it. Sarah looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was, not because she was hiding from something else, but because she had chosen to be there. That night, Emma dreamed about the community Christmas dinner Jake had mentioned. In the dream, she was standing outside the white church in Cedar Falls, watching warm light spill from the windows and hearing the sound of laughter and conversation from inside. In the dream, she wanted to go in but couldn't remember how to open the door. She woke with the strange feeling that the dream was telling her something important, though she couldn't quite grasp what it might be. As she made her morning coffee, Emma found herself looking at Sarah's photograph again, studying the expression of absolute belonging on the other woman's face. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Emma allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to belong somewhere not because she was hiding, but because she had chosen to build a life there. The thought was terrifying and appealing in equal measure, and she wasn't sure which emotion would win. Christmas Eve arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of high mountain morning that made the air itself seem to sparkle. Emma stood at her kitchen window, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The beauty was almost painful in its perfection, and for the first time, she understood what Sarah Sullivan had meant about not letting the cold keep her from seeing it. She'd spent the past few days studying Sarah's photograph album, memorizing the images of a valley she'd lived in for 3 years without truly seeing. The pictures revealed hiking trails she'd never explored, meadows she'd never visited, vantage points that would offer views she'd never experienced. Emma had been so focused on creating a safe retreat that she'd forgotten to actually live in the place she'd chosen. The realization had been troubling her sleep for several nights. What was the point of finding a beautiful place to heal if she never allowed herself to experience its beauty? She'd been so afraid of risking further hurt that she'd stopped risking anything at all, including joy. Around noon, Emma made a decision that surprised herself. She put on Sarah's winter coat and boots, grabbed a day pack with water and snacks, and set out to explore the valley that had been her home without her ever truly inhabiting it. The snow was perfect for snowshoeing, though Emma had to borrow her grandmother's ancient wooden snowshoes from the shed. They were heavy and unwieldy compared to modern equipment, but they worked well enough to carry her beyond the familiar boundaries of her property for the first time in 3 years. The trail that led north from her cabin was one she'd seen marked on the old Forest Service map her grandmother had kept, but Emma had never followed it beyond the first bend. Now she discovered that it wound through stands of pine and aspen toward a series of meadows that opened up like rooms in a vast house. The silence was different when she was moving through it rather than hiding within it. Instead of feeling empty, it felt expectant, alive with possibilities she'd trained herself not to notice. Emma realized she'd forgotten how much she used to enjoy hiking, the meditative rhythm of walking, and the sense of discovery that came with exploring new terrain. After an hour of steady climbing, she reached a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the entire valley. From this vantage point, she could see Jake Sullivan's ranch spread across the valley floor, with its neat clusters of buildings and the dark shapes of cattle dotting the snow-covered pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney of what appeared to be the main house, creating a vertical line against the vast sky. Emma found herself wondering what Jake was doing on his Christmas Eve. Was he alone with his memories of past holidays with Sarah, or did he have family visiting? The thought of him spending Christmas alone felt unexpectedly painful, and she realized with surprise that she'd begun to care about his well-being. The recognition that she was capable of caring about someone again should have felt encouraging, but instead it filled her with anxiety. Caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had led to devastating betrayal once before. But As Emma sat on the rocky outcrop looking down at Jake's ranch, she found herself remembering his words about the difference between independence and isolation. She pulled out her water bottle and the apple she'd packed, eating lunch while surrounded by a view that took her breath away. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks catching the afternoon sunlight like a crown of diamonds. This was what she'd been missing while hiding in her cabin, the reminder that there was a vast, beautiful world beyond her small sphere of safety. As she prepared to head home, Emma noticed another trail leading down from the outcrop in the direction of town. According to her grandmother's map, it would eventually connect with the main road about 2 miles from Cedar Falls. She'd never taken this route before, but something about the clear afternoon light and her newfound determination to stop hiding made her decide to explore it. The trail was longer than she'd expected, winding through terrain that changed from thick forest to open meadows to rocky creek beds. By the time she reached the main road, the sun was beginning to set, and Emma was farther from her cabin than she'd been in 3 years. She stood at the junction where the trail met the road, breathing hard from the long hike and feeling simultaneously exhilarated and apprehensive. To her left, the road led back toward her cabin, safety, and the familiar isolation she'd constructed. To her right, it led toward Cedar Falls, the unknown, and whatever possibilities might await her there. As if summoned by her indecision, the sound of an approaching vehicle reached her ears. Emma's first instinct was to step back into the forest until it passed, but something made her stand her ground. The truck that rounded the curve was Jake Sullivan's familiar pickup, and he slowed to a stop when he saw her standing beside the road. "Emma." He rolled down his window, looking concerned. "Everything okay? You're a long way from home." "I was hiking," she said, gesturing toward the trail behind her, "following one of the paths from my grandmother's old maps." Jake smiled, and Emma noticed how it transformed his weathered features. Sarah used to love that trail. She called it the perspective path because of the view from the top. Said it helped put things in their proper size. Emma nodded, understanding exactly what Sarah had meant. But the afternoon of hiking had awakened something in her that didn't want to retreat back to safety just yet. "If you're sure it's not out of your way." "Not at all. I was heading to town myself." Emma climbed into the passenger seat, immediately aware of how different the world looked from this vantage point. She'd forgotten how much easier it was to see the landscape when you weren't focused on the narrow view from her cabin windows. "Where were you planning to walk in town?" Jake asked as they drove. Emma realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't really have a plan. I just wanted to see it differently than I have before." Jake nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Christmas Eve a good time for that. The town puts up lights, and there's usually some kind of caroling at the church around sunset. Nothing fancy, just neighbors gathering to sing." Emma felt her chest tighten at the mention of gathering neighbors. "I'm not really good with groups of people anymore." "Neither am I, most of the time," Jake replied. "But sometimes being around people who aren't expecting anything from you can be easier than you think." They drove through Cedar Falls as the last light was fading from the sky. Emma was surprised to see how charming the small town looked with Christmas lights strung between the storefronts and warm light glowing from windows. It felt alive in a way that her monthly supply runs had never allowed her to notice. Jake parked near the small park in the center of town, where a group of perhaps 20 people had gathered around a gazebo decorated with lights and evergreen boughs. The sound of voices raised in harmony drifted across the snow-covered grass, familiar Christmas carols that Emma remembered from her childhood. "Would you like to walk over and listen?" Jake asked. "No pressure to join in or talk to anyone. Just listen if you want." Emma surprised herself by nodding. They walked slowly across the park, staying at the edge of the group where the shadows provided a sense of anonymity. The carolers ranged in age from children to elderly residents, their voices blending in simple harmonies that spoke of years of practice and genuine affection for the tradition. As Emma listened, she found herself recognizing some of the faces from her supply runs to town. The woman behind the counter at the general store, the postmaster who always nodded politely when she picked up mail, the mechanic who'd once helped her when her truck wouldn't start. These weren't strangers, she realized. They were neighbors she'd simply never allowed herself to know. When the carolers finished Silent Night, an elderly woman near the front of the group looked around and smiled at the gathered listeners. "Anyone else like to request a song?" Without thinking, Emma found herself speaking. "Do you know I'll be home for Christmas?" The words had escaped before she could stop them, and Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks as several faces turned toward her. But Instead of the judgment or intrusion she'd expected, she saw only friendly interest and welcoming smiles. "One of my favorites," the elderly woman replied warmly. "Let's give it a try." As the familiar melody began, Emma felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. The words spoke of longing and hope, of the possibility of finding home even when you'd been away for too long. She found herself humming along softly, then singing quietly, her voice joining the chorus of neighbors who'd made room for her without question. When the song ended, Jake touched her elbow gently. "There's hot chocolate and cookies in the church if you're interested." Anna Martinez brought her famous cinnamon cookies. Emma looked toward the warm light spilling from the church windows, then back at Jake's patient, understanding face. For 3 years, she'd been afraid that taking any step toward connection would lead to expectations and complications she couldn't handle. But standing here, surrounded by the simple kindness of neighbors sharing Christmas Eve, she wondered if she'd been wrong about the risks involved in allowing people to matter. "Maybe for a few minutes," she said. As they walked toward the church, Emma realized that the fear she'd carried for so long was still there, but it felt smaller somehow. Not gone, but manageable, like something she could carry rather than something that had to carry her. Inside the church, the gathering was warm and informal, with people clustered in small groups sharing conversation and refreshments. Emma accepted a cup of hot chocolate and found herself drawn into a gentle conversation with Anna Martinez, who turned out to be a retired teacher with kind eyes and an easy laugh. "You're the one living in the old Patterson cabin up the valley," Anna said. "We've all been hoping you'd come to one of our gatherings sometime." Emma was surprised by the admission. "You knew about me?" "Honey, this is a small valley," Anna laughed. "We all know about each other, even when we're trying to stay hidden. The question is whether we're going to be neighbors or just people who happen to live near each other." The distinction felt important, and Emma found herself considering it as the evening progressed. She'd spent 3 years being someone who lived near others rather than with them, and the isolation had felt safe but increasingly empty. As the gathering began to wind down, Jake appeared at her elbow. "Ready to head home?" Emma nodded, thanking Anna for the conversation and the cookies she pressed into Emma's hands for later. As they walked back to Jake's truck, Emma felt lighter than she had in years, as if some weight she'd been carrying without realizing it had been lifted. "Thank you," she said as they drove through the dark valley toward her cabin. "I've forgotten what it felt like to be around people who weren't trying to get something from me." "Most people aren't," Jake replied gently. "But it can take time to trust that again after someone breaks your faith in human nature." Emma was quiet for the rest of the drive, processing the evening and what it might mean for her carefully constructed solitude. When Jake pulled up to her cabin, she hesitated before getting out. "The Christmas dinner tomorrow," she said suddenly. "What time did you say it started?" Jake smiled, the expression visible in the dashboard lights. 5 o'clock. "But, Emma, come because you want to, not because you think you should. There's a difference." As she stood on her porch watching his taillights disappear down her driveway, Emma realized that for the first time in 3 years, she was looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply planning to survive it. Christmas morning dawned with the kind of pristine clarity that made Emma understand why people wrote poetry about winter light. She woke naturally as the first rays of sun crested the eastern peaks, and for the first time in 3 years, Christmas didn't feel like just another day to endure. She made coffee in her grandmother's blue ceramic mug and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. Artemis was perched on her usual fence post, feathers ruffled against the cold, but maintaining her dignified surveillance of the mountain morning. The sight of the red-tailed hawk made Emma smile. Even Artemis had found a way to be part of the landscape without being consumed by it. The decision about the Christmas dinner had kept Emma awake for much of the night. Part of her yearned for the connection and warmth she'd experienced the evening before, but another part clung to the safety of solitude that had protected her for so long. The internal debate felt exhausting, and Emma realized that she'd become as much a prisoner of her own indecision as of her isolation. Around noon, she made herself a simple lunch and tried to read, but the words seemed to blur together on the page. Her mind kept drifting to Jake's ranch, wondering what he was doing on this Christmas day. Was he having his own quiet celebration, or was he struggling with memories of holidays past? The thought of him spending Christmas alone while she sat in her cabin, being afraid, felt suddenly unacceptable. Emma set down her book and looked around her cabin with fresh eyes. The space that had felt like sanctuary for 3 years now seemed small and airless, like a beautiful cage she'd locked herself inside. The realization that she'd traded living for existing hit her with startling clarity. She'd been so focused on protecting herself from further hurt that she'd forgotten to consider what she might be missing. At 3 o'clock, Emma found herself standing in front of her small closet, staring at clothes she hadn't worn in years. Hidden behind her everyday flannel shirts and jeans was a deep blue sweater she'd loved in her previous life, soft cashmere that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd packed it when she fled to the mountains, but had never worn it, as if beautiful clothes belonged to the woman she used to be rather than the one she'd become. On impulse, she pulled out the sweater and held it against herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was thinner than she remembered, with sun-streaked hair that had grown long and wild, and eyes that held a wariness that hadn't been there before. But underneath the caution, Emma caught a glimpse of someone she'd almost forgotten, the woman who had once believed in possibilities. She showered and dressed carefully, choosing the blue sweater and her best jeans, then braiding her hair into a style that felt both practical and presentable. As she applied a touch of the makeup she hadn't worn in years, Emma felt like she was preparing for something more significant than just a community dinner. She was preparing to rejoin the world. At 4:30, Emma stood on her front porch holding a basket of the preserves she'd made from her summer garden. The gesture felt important, arriving with something to contribute rather than simply as someone seeking charity. The December air was sharp and clean, filling her lungs with the kind of clarity that made everything seem possible. Her truck started on the second try, and Emma drove slowly down the mountain road towards Cedar Falls, giving herself time to reconsider and turn back if her nerve failed. But with each mile, her resolve strengthened rather than weakened. She was tired of being afraid, tired of letting fear make her decisions for her. The white church was easy to find, just as Jake had said, its windows glowing warmly against the deepening twilight. Cars and trucks were parked along the street, and Emma could hear the sound of laughter and conversation drifting from the building. For a moment, her old instincts urged her to drive past and return to the safety of her cabin. Instead, she parked and sat for a minute, gathering her courage. Just for an hour, she told herself aloud. You can leave any time you want. The church door was propped open despite the cold, and Emma was immediately enveloped by warmth, light, and the mingled aromas of roast turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread. The sight that greeted her was both intimidating and welcoming. Perhaps 40 people of all ages gathered around long tables decorated with pine boughs and candles. Emma, Anna Martinez appeared at her side, beaming with genuine pleasure. You came. How wonderful. Before Emma could respond, she was gently swept into the gathering, introduced to smiling faces, and welcomed with the easy warmth that seemed to characterize this community. Nobody asked intrusive questions about where she'd been or why she'd stayed away so long. They simply made space for her at one of the tables and included her in the conversation as naturally as if she'd been coming to these dinners for years. Jake appeared as Emma was settling into her seat, and his smile when he saw her felt like a gift. I'm glad you decided to come, he said simply, taking the seat beside her. I'm not sure I would have without the push you gave me, Emma replied, surprised by her own honesty. Sometimes we all need a push, Jake said. Sarah used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. As the dinner progressed, Emma found herself relaxing into the rhythm of shared conversation and communal celebration. The food was delicious, prepared with the kind of care that spoke of traditions passed down through generations. But more than that, the gathering felt genuine in a way that Emma had almost forgotten was possible. She listened to stories about the valley's history, laughed at gentle teasing between neighbors who'd known each other for decades, and found herself sharing a few cautious details about her own life before the isolation. Nobody pushed for more information than she was comfortable giving, and the acceptance she felt was unconditional rather than dependent on performing a particular version of herself. During dessert, an elderly man named Frank Morrison asked if anyone wanted to share something they were grateful for this Christmas. Emma tensed, expecting to be put on the spot, but the sharing was entirely voluntary and ranged from simple appreciation for good health to thanks for neighbors who'd helped during difficult times. When the circle came around to Jake, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. I'm grateful for reminders that Sarah's wisdom lives on in this community, he said. And for neighbors who understand that sometimes the best gifts are the ones we give to people who need them most, whether they know it or not. His eyes met Emma's briefly, and she understood that he was talking about more than just winter clothes or firewood. He was talking about the gift of inclusion, of being welcomed back into the human community she'd exiled herself from. When it was Emma's turn, she almost passed, but something about the genuine warmth surrounding her made her want to participate fully. I'm grateful for being reminded that courage can be as simple as showing up, she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. And for neighbors who made room for someone who forgot how to be neighborly. After dinner, as people began clearing tables and washing dishes, Emma found herself working alongside women who chatted easily while they cleaned up. The domestic rhythm felt foreign after years of solitary meals and cleanups, but also comfortingly normal. You know, said a woman named Beth who lived closer town, we have a book club that meets once a month. Very informal, just a chance to discuss whatever we're reading and share recommendations. You'd be welcome to join if you're interested. Emma's automatic response was to politely decline, but she caught herself before the words escaped. What kind of books do you read? Everything, Beth laughed. Last month we discussed a mystery novel, and next month we're tackling a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. It's more about the conversation than any particular literary merit. I'd like to think about it, Emma said, surprising herself. Of course. We meet the second Saturday of each month at the library. No pressure to commit to anything, just come if you feel like it. As the evening wound down, Emma found herself reluctant to leave. The gathering had reminded her of everything she'd missed about human connection. The laughter, the shared stories, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. She'd forgotten that community could feel supportive rather than suffocating when it was built on genuine care rather than social obligation. Jake offered to follow her home, concerned about her driving the mountain roads in the dark, but Emma declined. She needed the drive alone to process what the evening had meant and what it might change about her carefully constructed solitude. As she drove through the valley under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, Emma found herself thinking about the past 3 years differently. She'd come to the mountains to heal, and in some ways she had. The constant anxiety that had characterized her life after David's betrayal had faded, replaced by a kind of hard-won peace. But somewhere along the way, healing had become hiding, and peace had become paralysis. Tonight had shown her that she could choose differently. She could remain in the mountains she'd grown to love, while still being part of the community that had welcomed her. She didn't have to choose between safety and connection. She could have both if she was willing to risk being vulnerable again. When Emma reached her cabin, she sat in her truck for several minutes, looking at the small building that had been her entire world for so long. It would always be her refuge, but it didn't have to be her prison. She could venture out into the world and still have this place to return to, this sanctuary that belonged entirely to her. Inside, she made tea and sat by the fire with Sarah Sullivan's photo album open on her lap. The picture of Sarah standing in the meadow with her arms spread wide seemed to glow in the firelight, and Emma finally understood what she saw in the other woman's expression. Sarah looked like someone who had found the perfect balance between solitude and connection, between independence and interdependence. Emma turned to a blank page at the back of the album and picked up a pen. In careful handwriting, she wrote, December 25th, remembered how to say yes to life again. Remembered that healing doesn't require hiding forever. As she prepared for bed, Emma found herself looking forward to the new year with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not the desperate hope she'd brought with her to the mountains 3 years ago, but the steady hope that comes from understanding that you have choices, even when they feel scary. Tomorrow, she decided she would take another hike through the valley, but this time she would bring her camera and take pictures of her own. She would create her own album of the place she'd chosen to call home, documenting not just its beauty, but her growing understanding of how to live within it rather than simply survive in it. And perhaps, when she felt ready, she would invite Jake for coffee and show him the pictures. Not because she owed him anything, but because sharing beauty really was a way of doubling it, just as Sarah had believed. For the first time in 3 years, Emma fell asleep on Christmas night with a smile on her face, and The windows of her cabin opened to the mountain air, no longer afraid that the outside world might find its way in.